couple minutes to get started either.
Great. So, hello everybody. Thanks for being here and joining us today for a Friends from the Field webinar. The title of this webinar is Biology, History, and Identification and Management of Invasive Jumping Worms in Maine. My name is Marin Brock, and I'm the Outreach Coordinator for Blue Hill Heritage Trust. And these webinars are co-hosted with Island Heritage Trust. So we also have Martha from Island Heritage Trust on the panel today. And before we begin, I wanted to say that we've been doing these webinars for a few years now. And if you're interested in looking at past webinar archives, you can find them on our website or on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars and online resources are free and open to the public, and every person is welcome to attend and take advantage of opportunities. If you appreciate the work we do and are interested in making a donation or contributing to our work, then you can donate on our website. And if you're already a donor, then thank you for your support. This is going to be the last webinar for the summer, as we're taking a break to focus on other projects during the summer, but we will be back doing webinars probably in September. So we hope that you can join us and stay tuned. All right, so now I'm going to pass it over to Martha to talk about some housekeeping logistics.
Sure. Well, we have the chat box, and that's where we'll put questions. We will hold the questions to the end, and Brittany will answer them at the end. But if you want to do raise the hand feature and ask the question yourself, we happily let you do that as well. So that will happen at the end as well.
Great. Awesome.
We're delighted to have Brittany with us today. It's such a timely topic.
Yeah, definitely. And so speaking of Brittany, I'm going to introduce our speaker. We're lucky enough to be joined by Brittany Schappach, who is a forest entomologist in the Forest Health and Monitoring, FHM, programs for the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry Division of the Maine Forest Service. Brittany earned her MS in entomology at the University of Maine, where her research focused on the biophysical and social perceptions of blacklegged tick range expansion related to climate change, which also sounds like a very pertinent topic for today. During her time attending UMaine, she was awarded the Fred Griffee Memorial Award for outstanding interdisciplinary graduate research and a certificate for her interdisciplinary studies. Brittany joined the Maine Forest Service in 2022 and has been primarily working with the public on education and outreach on invasive species such as browntail moth and jumping worms. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Brittany.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks everybody for being here. I have a lot to cover. There's plenty of slides, so I'm just going to dive right in, but very happy to still have time at the end of this session for a Q&A. So, jumping worms. A couple of things that we should know, but I want to get into the basics first. So just talking about what earthworms are is a really great place to start. So they are invertebrates, meaning they don't have a backbone. They're covered in this slimy-like substance that kind of helps them slither around and protects themselves. They are primarily eating decaying roots, leaves, bacteria, fungi, you name it. They're probably going to go for it. And they are all over the world. They live in soils. You might be familiar with some of them. I just put some species on the slide here, but we've got common things like red wiggler. We have our night crawlers, blackhead worms, and other varieties. So for the biology of an earthworm, it's really important before we start talking about jumping worms to really understand where in the soil we're talking about when we're talking about where worms are. So first things first, if we're talking about the leaf litter layer, 1 to 3 inches, you're going to be finding this is the epigeic layer. This is where you're most often going to find your red wigglers. The next layer down is endogeic. This is our topsoil layer. This is about 6 to 10 inches into the ground. These are things like leaf worms. And then we have Invasive, which is the guys that go really, really deep down into the subsoil, up to 6 feet. And most commonly, this is where we find our common night crawlers, or otherwise known as the European night crawler. So you've got our 3 different levels here. Also important to note that there are actually no native earthworms in the state of Maine, and this is because of a glaciation event that happened a very, very long time ago, where the majority of the state, or the whole state, majority of New England, was covered in an ice sheet, which killed off any worms that were here. And then, of course, when the ice melted and everything sort of regrew back, there were no worms anymore. And so all of the worms that we have here today are basically from introduction from people or just natural migration back into the Northeast. So we have an introduction of invasive worms. Jumping worms are following the path just like everything else did. So what are jumping worms? They go by a lot of different names. I've heard them called crazy worms, snake worms, Alabama jumpers. There's 3 species technically that fall under what a jumping worm is considered. But for the purposes of today and just in general for identification, all 3 of the species can be identified with the same exact key. So there's distinct differences between them, but for all intents and purposes, if they have all of the signs that I'm going to go over today, it is a jumping worm. They're native to Eastern Asia, so that means that they're non-native and invasive in the state of Maine. And when we're talking about what invasive means, it's essentially just that they are not originally from the state and that they cause some kind of ecological harm. And we'll get into the details of that in just a little bit. So jumping backwards just a little bit here, when we're talking about earthworm biology, jumping worms are going to be on that very first layer. So the very first one that I was talking about, the epigeic layer, and this is really important to understanding their life cycle. So if they're only found on the top 2 inches of the soil layer, that also means that they can't really live for a very long time because they can't survive our Maine winters, okay? So if we're thinking here in terms of the year life cycle for these jumping worms, they only live a year. So I've got highlighted here September and October, and that's because this is the time of year where you can really actually identify the jumping worms because they have a structure called a clitellum. And I'll show photos of this in just a bit, but if you're trying to identify worms, we're in June right about now, so much of them are still going to be very young. They're not going to have these reproductive structures. They might look like every other worm. They're pretty hard to identify. So the best time to identify the jumping worms is going to be later fall time, so September, October. So speaking of timeline here, we do have our juveniles that are out now, May and June. They're just a smaller version of the worm. They start to become reproductively mature in July, so next month. And then they are basically reproducing from July until October, and they grow very fast. They throw all of their energy into reproduction. And they reproduce pretty specially comparatively to our other worms that we have here. And this is a term called parthenogenetic. And essentially, this just means that they don't need a mate to reproduce. They can just reproduce on their own, which also means that it only takes one worm or one egg to produce an entire colony for a garden or for a forest. So you can start to see how this becomes fairly problematic. So in October, really like November, realistically, the first couple of really hard frosts, because again, they're in the top 2 layers of the leaf litters, the top of the soil, there's nothing insulating them. So when we get those really hard frosts, they do die. They don't have an exoskeleton like insects. They don't have anything to protect themselves. So they reproduce, they lay their eggs. The first couple of hard frosts really kills them. So the worms themselves die, but the eggs, which are covered in a silk-like material, what we're seeing here is egg cocoons, those overwinter and those survive quite well in Maine winters. So that is really the root of the problem. So worms are dying, they're laying their eggs, the eggs survive over the winter, and then the eggs are hatching come May. So that's a little bit of background on the life cycle, and important here just to understand that it only takes one worm or one egg to really start a population. So like I said, they do overwinter as eggs inside of these cocoons, and these cocoons are very, very small. So this photo that I have here is just comparative to, it's comparing it to the face of a penny. They're very indistinguishable from soil. So if you're hoping that maybe you'll be able to look for the cocoons and maybe pick them out of your garden, you just can't. Even the trained eye, you're not going to be able to identify it, unfortunately. They're very hard to see. They blend in with the soil quite well. Further problematic is that the silk that's covering the actual eggs protects them from the Maine cold. So if you're thinking, oh, we're in Maine, it gets pretty chilly here, it does, but they can do a pretty good job just with the silk protecting the egg inside. And it's also helped them from desiccation. So they're not drying out. They're doing pretty well as a little egg inside of their cocoons. And if you can imagine how difficult they are to see, they are really hard to see with the eye. So they're very easily spread around places. So if you're going hiking somewhere and you've got a nice thick hiking boot, you're walking around, you might be picking up clumps of soil that have things like these cocoons in them, and you're walking around and spreading them without even knowing. So very hard to detect, very easy to spread. So identification for these jumping worms, this is a photo that I took last year in September, I believe. So this is right about the peak time that the majority of the worms you're going to see, if they are jumping worms, are going to be adults, which means that they have this reproductive structure, the collar around their neck, which we call the clitellum. Now, we also have our common night crawlers. So these can be out at the same time. I've seen them in the same area before. They kind of cohabitate. It's important to understand the differences between a mature night crawler and a mature jumping worm. So a little bit about the night crawler biology. They can be about the same length, so I wouldn't really go by length. What's really key here is, again, the clitellum. And so if we're looking here, I wonder if I have, I'm looking for my laser pointer, but I am not seeing it. So, that's a bummer. Oh, can I draw? Oh, I can draw. That's cool. All right, so we have our clitellum down here. And so it's what we refer to as saddle shaped. So it doesn't fully meet the worm all the way around. It's kind of open at this bottom. And so this is what's going to be the key here, which is very different from what a jumping worm clitellum looks like. So we're looking for saddle shaped. Oftentimes this collar of the worm is raised. It might be like swollen. It's like lifted off from the body. It's also happening in the middle of the body. So we are saying here that it's segment 32 to 37. Which might mean nothing to you. Just, if you're thinking about the head of the worm and the tail of the worm, it's the clitellum's right about in the middle. And I think I've just found my laser pointer, so I'm really trying. Oh, hopefully you can see that. Hopefully we can see that now. So we're looking at the clitellum. So very important here. Saddle shaped. Oftentimes these are also slow moving. They're a little bit shy. Things to keep in mind, different than jumping worms. So jumping worms, again, we're looking at the clitellum. We have it here. And so right at this is right at the front of the head. So segments 14 through 16, whereas the common night crawler, again, middle of the body, this one's much closer to the head. It's also smooth and it's flat. Some folks will go by color, citing it's a milky white, it's a gray. That's true, but sometimes they even look a bit pink. So I don't like to go by color. I just like to go by shape. So if you were to pick this up, there's no harm. They don't hurt you. There's no toxin or anything. You can pick these up if you're not squeamish, I guess. But you can pick them up. If you look around, if the clitellum is circular and it goes all the way around, almost dead giveaway that it is a jumping worm. If it's got that saddle shape where it's open and it doesn't quite meet all the way around, that would be your night crawler. So like I said before, the younger worms are more difficult to identify, and that's just because the younger worms aren't reproductively mature. They don't have a clitellum. So it's not impossible to ID them, but it's much easier if you're doing your ID in September or October. So again, here, just another image. It's the clitellum of the night crawler. We've got our clitellum here. It's not fully meeting all the way around. So we've got this gap. And again, middle of the body. So not all the way around. These are jumping worms. These are photos that I took from Maine. So again, we're seeing September and October here. We're seeing a fairly smooth clitellum. Nothing's raised here. It's not saddle shaped. And this one down here looks like it might be a little bit raised, like it's a little bit swollen. It typically doesn't get any more swollen than this. This is about what I would expect for October, and it's usually just swollen because they are in the reproductive phase. They're getting ready to lay eggs. or they had recently laid eggs. So otherwise, pretty smooth, pretty flat. It's got this, milky white color, but sometimes it looks a little bit pink, but we're really checking that clitellum. The other thing you can do is look for these things called setae or hairs. And this is really only good if you've got a hand lens. You really can't see this with the naked eye, but what you are looking for is if you're looking at the segment of the worm, they have bristle-like hairs all over their body. And this is really helping them with movement. If you're thinking about jumping worms, they got their name because they jump. They don't actually jump, but they thrash around. They're they move around. They've got a lot of energy. Hence the name snake worms. They move like a snake. So they're very quick. Comparatively to our European nightcrawler, for instance, they have less hairs. It's really just a widely paired kind of thing. And they're not as mobile as jumping worms. So visualize, I don't have a photo of jumping worms, unfortunately. I don't have a good enough camera to really capture this, but this is a photo of the hairs on a European nightcrawler. And so we're looking at the segments here, and I've got arrows pointing at the little hairs. And so essentially this is just saying that this is widely paired. So they don't have the bristles all the way around the worm. It's just these sets right on the edge. And we can kind of see like these little tiny spikes, and then it's smooth and then it's spiky again. Whereas if this was a jumping worm, I'm hoping to get the photo some point in time this year, but if this was a jumping worm, we wouldn't see this widely paired where there was sections of smoothness. We would just see the bristles all the way around the worm. So again, I don't have a photo of it, unfortunately, but something else you can look for if you've got a hand lens. This is also true of the juveniles. So if you've got a whole bunch of worms and they don't have a clitellum to identify it yet, this is another option to be able to ID it. So again, it's a little bit hard, especially when they're thrashing around. So I don't often recommend this method, but if you're really dying to know what you've got, this might be a way to do it. So sort of mentioned this before, we're looking at the behavior. Jumping worms, again, they got their name. They're thrashing around, they're jumping, they're moving around very well. They've got a very characteristic movement that they do where they'll take their head and flip it back to the tail, kind of like an S movement, sort of like how a snake would do. So if you're holding it in the palm of your hand, it'll do this nose to tail action and it'll flip itself right out. If you put a whole bunch of these into a bucket, they can crawl out of the bucket. They're very mobile. They're very good at doing that. So they are capable of climbing. They move around, and again, they don't jump. That's just their nickname. The other thing that you can do to identify a jumping worm is check for the tail drop. Now, I don't often use this as a way to ID jumping worms compared to other worms. They drop their tail more often, but our common nightcrawler will also do a tail drop. So this is maybe something to look out for. It might be the one thing to help you really finish that ID, but for the most part, not something I'm going to follow. But it is true that jumping worms, they drop their tail more often. And that's mostly just because when they're being predated on, they will let go of their tail in hopes that whatever is trying to eat them will go for the tail instead of them. So something to know, but not really super great with ID. So jumping worms can be anywhere. Primarily, they're going to be in the soil. You can find them in compost. You can even find them in mulch. They can eat wood. So it really, like I said before, if they can eat it, they're going to go for it, which also means that they're in gardens, they're in the forests, they could be in your crop beds. Really anywhere they can survive, they will be. As far as where they are in the state or in the United States, I've got this graph here. It is a bit outdated at this point. This is from 2017. So the very dark gray colors in this graph, all the way up into Canada, are potential range of jumping worms just based on climate. And each little white dot that you're seeing is a confirmed case. So again, this is from 2017, so there's only like a handful of confirmed cases in Maine in 2017. But the updated chart looks something more like this. And so we first detected them in Maine in 2014. They are confirmed in 13 out of our 16 counties. They are now considered widespread. When I first started giving this talk a couple of months ago, I guess almost a year ago, I was saying they weren't widespread because we didn't think that they were. And then the end of 2023 happened, and we got a flood of reports. And so you're seeing all of this brown all throughout southern central Maine. These are all confirmed reports of jumping worms just from 2023, just from last year. So unfortunately, they are pretty established in southern parts of the state. We haven't quite found them in the county yet. We do expect them to sort of make their way up there, probably just a matter of time and accidental spreading around. But it's important to know that they are widespread. So if you do have them in your garden or in your forest, and you're on this map, it's already documented, it's likely that other people are struggling with the same thing that you are. However, if you do have it, maybe you're from Washington County, or you've got land somewhere else and you're seeing jumping worms and we don't have it on this list, please let me know, because I would like to update this list. So just send in a report and I'll have the report form at the end. But just keep in mind, it is widespread. We still are getting reports, but we understand that it is everywhere at this point. How did they get to Maine? We don't really know the whole story. We don't know the origin, but what likely happened is that it was on imported plants or other agricultural materials. And it wasn't likely the worms themselves, it was the cocoons, because again, they just blend into the soil so easily. And even the trained eye, they're very hard to detect. So it's just unfortunate, but it wasn't intentional. And as you can imagine, it can be spread around pretty easily, hard to detect. So things like mulch piles or community compost, plant sales, just, you don't know you have them and you're giving plants to your friends, or you're donating compost to a community compost pile and you've got a bunch of cocoons in there. It's usually not intentional, but if other people are taking that compost back to their place, it only takes one. It just takes one worm, just takes one cocoon to start a whole new population. So if you get nothing else from this talk today, well, hopefully you get more, but if you get nothing else, understand that the root of the problem when it comes to jumping worms is not the actual worms, it's really the cocoons. We can control the worms, but the cocoons are much, much, much harder to control. Again, hard to see, easy to spread. They've got nice silk covering on them, so they withstand our coldest winters. There's also this idea of seed banking. And so essentially what that means is that if you have some eggs that are hatching one year, that means that they don't all hatch in the same year. So they might all be hatched or laid rather in one year, but some might wait until the next year to hatch, or the next year, or the year after that. So it's sort of this like overlapping generations where you might be able to really knock them down, but then you still have cocoons in your soil that were laid a couple of years ago that are now hatching. So it's just this overlap in generations to try to, they've evolved that way just so that they can prolong their species. So, and also just not great news. So if you're thinking, oh, well, they're an earthworm, so they can't be that bad. They keep the nutrients in the soil. They turn over the nutrients, so the soil's more fertile, or organic matter, their food source. I don't mean to ruin your day. I just offer a different perspective, and one that we are still learning. So you've probably seen headlines like this. It's earthworm on steroids. Something to look out for. They're everywhere. Here's what you need to know. They're invaders. They're threatening the soils. Throughout this whole thing, it's a pretty hot topic. I want you to understand that this is still very, very new. We are still learning. There's no answer. Nobody has the right answer to anything. There's still a lot of research that's being done, and a lot of questions that we don't have answers to. And if we do have answers, it only leads us to more questions. So there's wonderful research being done, but unfortunately, there's just a lot that we don't know. So while I go into this next segment, it's important to understand that these are things that might happen, not necessarily things that are currently happening that have been documented. So just keep this in mind. So we're just staying informed. So jumping worms, when it comes to what they do to the soil, is they change the consistency of it. And so essentially the best way I can compare it is basically nerds candy, coffee grounds, like taco meat consistency. It's dry, it's loose, it's not nutrient rich. You can see in both of these photos, there's not really a lot of leaf litter layer anymore. It's just the bare soil, which can cause problems, as I'm sure you can imagine. So again, more images here, soil infested with jumping worms versus our normal untouched soil. And when you have dry and loose soil like this, the main problem, the main concern is that you can start to see erosion happening. There's other issues here too, but for our forests, which is mostly what I am seeing, or what I'm monitoring for, is this erosion. And so this is fairly bad because it'll expose tree roots. It'll also expose plant roots too. So if you've got a nice native forest and you have these healthy trees and these healthy native plants, and you have something like jumping worms that come in, they disrupt all of the leaf litter layer, and then they make the soil so loose that any animal walking by or any rainfall that happens washes the soil away. And so you have these exposed roots, which of course can lead to disease and other opportunistic insects that are just going to come in and attack the tree or the plant because it's stressed, because its roots are exposed. So you're losing soil over time, which can cause issues for these native plants and trees. And you can also see what happens is when you lose that top layer just erodes away. Over time, the soil can also become really compacted, which is not really conducive to healthy plants and trees getting their roots in. So on top of having the erosion issues, you also just have really bad nutrient poor soil. And so their casings, when they're eating all of the leaf litter layer and the soils, and they're getting all these nutrients, what they excrete is what's considered or called casings. And so while their casings are fairly nutrient rich, they're on the top, remember, because they're on the top 2 inches of the layer of the soil. And so they're not where the roots are. So we're taking those nutrients away from the plants and the trees. So not so great for sustainability. And it also is very disruptive for our fungus and root relationships if we're seeing a lot of these roots become exposed to the air. So in areas where they're not really supposed to be. So in this image here, we have lightly infested on the left, and we've got heavily infested on the right. And so in our lightly infested, this is what we consider our healthy forest. We've got nice soil layers. We have a nice thick and spongy layer. We've got our leaf litter layer, and then we have a bunch of plants on the top that are doing quite well. Not to mention we have our healthily stabilized root system. And so when you have a bunch of jumping worms that come in and they overturn the top of the soil so fast, they make it dry and crumbly and nutrient poor, you start to lose soil. You lose the entire leaf litter is fairly gone. You lose that top layer of soil, so you're having these exposed plant roots, and you're also losing the plant diversity, which is problematic because if you have soil that doesn't really support a lot of the good plants, you're allowing there to be a competition between our native plants and invasive plants. Invasive plants do quite well in soil that's not as ideal. So stuff like this can lead to invasive species really coming in and wreaking havoc in a forest system. So not super great. So we're losing plant diversity. Because we're losing plant diversity, if we think about what relies on plants, we're also losing our insects. If we end up losing our trees, or we lose tree health because their roots are exposed and they're uprooted, we're also losing things that use that tree, like birds and squirrels and small mammals and things like that. So you're actually changing the wildlife or the ecosystem, or have the potential to change the ecosystem in an area. And the soil's just not great. So you're really not going to get that regrowth of plants and trees that are normally supposed to be in that area. So if you have something like increased forest damage, in this case from jumping worms, you've got poor soil. Like I was saying before, you might have an increase in invasive plant presence. So things like garlic mustard, Japanese barberry, glossy buckthorn, these are all invasive plants in Maine, meaning, again, they did not evolve with other plants and trees here, and they cause some kind of harm. In this case, they're just out competing our native plants and trees. And so if we're seeing this poor forest soil, these have more of an opportunity to really root in and expand, and change the ecosystem, and what just changes the wildlife that's supported in that area. So also has the potential to not be so great. Now, I do have a red star on Japanese barberry, and that's because there's actually a lot of research that supports the idea that Japanese barberry creates the perfect microclimate for blacklegged ticks. So if we have soil that's not so great, and we have Japanese barberry that loves this not so great soil, it might also create a habitat in which ticks can really thrive. So for all intents and purposes, not super great. And again, this is somewhat hypothetical. These are just possibilities, just based on the biology of the soil and how plants interact with soils and things like that. So it's another potential consequence that folks are definitely monitoring. So if you are still, thinking earthworms, these are earthworms, so maybe they're good. These are invasive species. They do upset the soil chemistry and the nutrients available to our plants and trees, which makes it harder for other things to thrive, and maybe allows invasive plants to really thrive. So it does really have the potential to damage forests. So it is something that we do care about. We want to keep a good eye on. So some of the things that we can do to try to prevent jumping worms from spreading further into the state or further into our gardens and our forests, there's this idea of arriving clean and leaving clean. So cleaning soil off of debris from vehicles, equipment, boots, other gear before arriving or leaving hiking trails or forests is really important. And so we don't often think about going into our garden and then going into our forest, maybe if we're throwing it into the compost or something. But if you do have jumping worms, and you know that you have jumping worms, I would start to really think and be conscious about where I am walking, because again, it doesn't take much for these cocoons to just get stuck in the tread of your boot or of your sneaker and get spread around all over your house. So it's not what we want. We do want to slow the spread on that. Another option, especially if you're hiking around, I always keep a boot brush in my truck, just so I know that if I'm going somewhere where there are jumping worms, I'm not taking them back home with me, or I'm not even entertaining that risk. I'm just going to wipe my shoes off, and that's again to just try to dislodge any of the soil with possible cocoons in it. So another thing you can do is just cleaning tools to and from site. Again, we're really just trying to minimize the amount of soil clumps that are stuck to our tools to try to minimize the amount of cocoons that are getting around. So if you have landscapers coming to your house, or if you have a gardener that uses tools on your garden and with other people's gardens, or you have friends or something like that, just make sure we're cleaning the tools in between sites. We don't want to introduce infested soil into a non-infested area, because it only takes one. If you do have clumps of soil and you know that they came from a jumping worm site, or you suspect, or you're just worried that maybe they have cocoons on them, what you can do is you can rinse those roots in like a bucket or a trash bag or something like that, just to keep it contained, instead of rinsing it, onto the grass into your garden. So we do want to rinse it, but we want to rinse it into an enclosed container, and then we can take care of it by throwing it out, or sifting it, taking care of the water, and then just throwing out the soil, the hard stuff, throwing it out. More things here. We're not purchasing jumping worms for any kind of composting, and we're not using them for gardening, and we're not using them for fishing bait. I know that the temptation is pretty high for some folks because they hear jumping worms or crazy worms or snake worms, and they think, oh, that's great because they're just going to be wiggling on the hook and fish are going to love that. They don't necessarily do that. They don't really wiggle once they are on a hook. So it doesn't, I get the thought process, but it's not so effective, and it's an invasive species, so we really don't want them here. And further, if you have leftover worms, we're definitely not wanting to throw them right into the woods after we're done fishing for the day. We want to take those worms back with us, put them in your fridge, throw them in a trash, keep them contained. We don't want to release them out in the wild. Sort of on that same note, we also don't want to throw away infested yard waste. If we know that we have jumping worms, we don't want to just be throwing those into the woods and then allowing the cocoons to hatch the following year and then spread worms into our forest. That would also not be good. And my hope for today is also that you're taking this information and you're spreading it to other people, because I know I can't reach everybody. So it's so helpful to me and all the folks doing jumping worm research if we're taking what we are learning and then telling our folks about it. We're telling our gardening friends, we're telling our neighbors, or we're directing them to places where they can help themselves, or at least call me so I can help them. Another important thing we went over, just knowing the signs. So we're educating ourselves, we're understanding their jumping worm life cycle. We remember that the best time to ID jumping worms is in September, October, or earlier if you have a hand lens and you can check the hairs around their bodies. We're also looking for soil characteristics. So maybe you're not seeing the jumping worms, but you're seeing something that looks like this image I have on the left. So loose, dry soil, no leaf litter layer, maybe some erosion happening. I hope you start to think, oh, there might be something here. There might be something going on. Let me investigate a little bit further. You can also monitor for jumping worms. If you rake the leaf litter layer, especially in really heavy infested areas, the ground looks like it's moving. So sometimes you don't even have to rake. You can just kind of kick your boot around and you'll see them all kind of jump up and start thrashing around. It's really insane. The other option is a mustard solution, which I think I have a slide on, so I will withhold talking about that till we get to that slide. We're also just being really smart with what we're purchasing. Now that we know about jumping worms, it's a really good idea to buy bare root plants when you can. I understand that some plant species are really sensitive to that, but if there's some way for you to just check to make sure that there's no soil clumps that might have cocoons attached to the root when we're rerooting it, it would be in your best interest to not incorporate new cocoons to an area that does not have jumping worms. You can also ask plant nurseries if they're heat treating any of their soil or their compost or their mulch. That way, you know that there's at least some steps that have been taken to prevent pests like jumping worm cocoons. And just checking for signs. If you're seeing a nursery and maybe there's a tree or something that you're thinking about purchasing, but you're looking at the soil and it's not looking so great, might be important to have a conversation about that nursery. So this is that report form that I was talking about earlier. If you do think that you have jumping worms, you can report it to us, and this is just on our website. So this is you can type in jumping worms, DACF, Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. That's us. It'll bring you to this page, and I've got a red arrow here just showing you where to find the report form. It'll ask you questions locationally, like where you found the jumping worms, how many jumping worms you found. And that's just to help us understand a little bit more about how they're spreading, maybe how long that they've been in an area. But we need photos. So if you send a report and you don't include any photos, we'll get back to you asking for photos, because we can't identify whether or not they are jumping worms if there's nothing to look at. So if you do want to report to us, just make sure you're taking good photos. If there's clitellums available, make sure that it's pretty clear in the photo, or we can do a site visit. So just let us know regardless. Try to take photos if you can. If you think that you got worms from compost or potted plants, this is really important to reach out to our state horticulturalist. This is Gary Fish. He is phenomenal. He works in the horticulture department. His email is on this slide. It's just gary.fish@maine.gov. And he can reach out to that nursery that might have jumping worms and then investigate further. So you're not getting the nursery in trouble or anything like that. It's just important that we are trying to stop the spread when we can. Further, if you think you have jumping worms, like I said before, you can give us a call. You can send in a report form. Most importantly, try not to panic. They're pretty widespread at this point. And I know that doesn't make it better, but there are other folks that are going through the same thing that you are. And at this point, if you have them, it's just preventing them from getting to the rest of your garden, getting to your forest, getting to your neighbors, or your neighbors preventing it from getting to you. So education is really, really important. Prevention is really, really important. But all in all, it is okay. It is what it is. Try not to panic. There are things that we can do. So I'll get into that. Management, tricky, really tricky. Again, we're still learning. A lot we don't know. So this might even provide you with more questions than you went into this research, this presentation going for. Research is ongoing. So there's a lot of questions out there. We're trying our best to answer it. There are some questions that we can answer, some that we just don't. So just keep in mind, still very early on in this process, was only found in Maine a couple of years ago. So patience, not panicking, patience. One saving grace that I do want to touch on here is because they are parthenogenetic. Again, this means that it only takes one. They don't need a mate to reproduce. This means that they're going to be fairly low in genetic diversity. So the example that I like to use is if we have this one worm that made its way into your garden. Let's say this worm has a peanut allergy. This is hypothetical. Worms don't have peanut allergies, but for this situation, let's say that they do. Okay, so this worm is going to reproduce parthenogenetically on its own, basically clones itself, which means that its offspring also have a peanut allergy. That means that when its offspring have offspring, all of those offspring also have peanut allergies. And so if we can find a solution, like we're dropping a whole bunch of peanuts in the soil, again, there's no such thing as peanut allergies in worms, but in this situation, if we drop a whole bunch of like peanut oil in the soil or something like that, it'll kill everything. It'll kill all of them because they all have the same defect. They're all very low genetic diversity here because they're just clones of itself. So this could be, once we find something that's effective, it could be really effective for the majority of populations. So again, we don't have anything yet, but this is maybe something to keep in mind, maybe a saving grace for you. Chemical treatments, there's currently no products on the market listed for use to manage jumping worms. Using any kind of product that is being used for a pest like jumping worms that the pest is not listed on the label is not legal anywhere. So I encourage you to not experiment with things that may or may not work in your garden. You might be harming your plants or other insects or mammals by doing that. Leave the research to the researchers. I know that it's frustrating to try to figure out what a solution is, but it's way better to keep what we know. We know what works and we know what doesn't work. We just don't have anything that works safely for jumping worms right now. So let's leave the research to the researchers. Again, things are ongoing. I'm so hopeful we'll find something in the near future for as far as effective products. We just don't have anything right now. What we can do instead is this concept called solarization. And this is basically using the sun to kill the worms and kill the cocoons. The worms die when they reach about 85 degrees Fahrenheit. The cocoons need a little bit more heat, so they will die at about 104 degrees Fahrenheit, as long as that temperature is sustained for a couple of days. Now, the way that you can achieve this is by laying out a thin layer of soil on something like a tarp, and you want to cover the tarp with something clear like painter's drop cloth or something. You're basically making like a little gift package. So you want to tuck in the sides of the bottom tarp with the top. That's so that the worms can't escape. And the clear is going to be really important. You don't want to use black because that's going to reflect the light away. You want to use something clear so the sun can really get into that soil and heat it up. Leave it somewhere in a sunny place. Once you've got your package, it's all secured for a couple of days. And that basically sterilizes the soil. So any worms that are present are going to die. And when it's really hot, like this upcoming summer, you've got it right in the soil. You can also kill the cocoons, again, as long as we're over 104 degrees Fahrenheit for a number of days, at least 3 days. And so this works. It could work in a raised garden bed, but you need to have something contained. If your plan is to do this in an area that's in an open garden, the worms will just move away from the direct sunlight. They're not going to stay there. So the cocoons can't move, obviously, because they're eggs, but you want to kill everything because the worms are in this situation also still the problem. So contain it. You can solarize it. The soil is clean. So duct tape, you can secure it with rocks, but you want to make sure that the worms can't escape. And again, minimum of 3 days, and this is only going to be effective in the late spring, summer, when it's hot. You can't do this in the winter, unfortunately. It just doesn't get hot enough. And the worms are going to be dead by then. So something to keep in mind. Important to note here, not a long-term solution. Definitely not a long-term solution. The worms are very likely going to come back. Again, it's not perfect. It can work in really small situations, things like raised garden beds. But just understand this is effort and work for something that is not a long-term solution, and worms might come back. Pan removal is an option. If you've got, again, a smaller garden, something contained, you can throw the worms into a bag, leave that in the sun for a couple of days, throw that bag in the trash. Same kind of idea. The more worms that you can reduce, the less, they're going to produce cocoons in an area. So could be effective for smaller infestations, but again, a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and the worms are probably going to come back. So you can reduce populations, but you're not going to kill everything. As far as what the state does, it's not a regulated invasive species in Maine, so we can't take any other action beyond things like this, so like educational events, webinars, and things like that. But we are cooperating with a multi-agency working group. So we're working with folks at the University of Massachusetts, Cornell, University of Vermont, and Yale to try to get the researchers together, figure out what science is working, and then communicate that to folks like me who can relay that information back to folks like you. So we are definitely coordinating. The work is being done. We just don't have anything super effective right now besides solarization. I did run a surveillance study last year. This is jumping back to that mustard solution. If you have lighter infestations and you're kicking around or you're raking that leaf litter layer and you're not really seeing any worms, what you can do is you can mix together water and just regular ground mustard together. The mustard is really irritating to the outside of the worm's body. And so if you mix it up really well and then you pour it over the soil, you move the leaves out of the way, you just pour it right onto the soil. It's irritating and the worms want to get away, so they'll come all to the surface. So it's a good way for you to just pick them out and then look at the clitellum and check IDs that way. Keep in mind, this is going to pull all of the worms to the surface. So you might see other worm species like the common nightcrawler, but hopefully we've learned the difference in the clitellum. So it's an option. The mustard's not going to kill the worms. It's just going to irritate them. So the worms are not going to die. And it's fairly safe for things like plants as well. So just really a detection method. It's not going to control the worms. We do have really good resources on our website. Again, this is just jumping worms page at the DACF, things like where they were found, report forms, links to other things like cooperative extensions that have really cool fact sheets. So definitely check out that website if you haven't already. And I also have a QR code here that you can scan right now with your cell phone. You just open up the camera app, hover over, it should have a pop-up that'll bring you right to a report form, and you can send in a report that way. But remember, if you do send in a report form, please include photos so it can help us identify the worms for you. If you have any other questions, or if you think of other questions outside of the presentation today, feel free to send me an email. I've included my email on this page as well. And it looks like there's about 10 minutes so, and I can't see the chat. So thank you for listening. Thank you for coming tonight. And I'm really happy to answer questions if there are any.
Great. Thank you so much, Brittany. That was really amazing. It has a really well put together presentation.
Thanks so much.
I learned a lot about jumping worms that I didn't realize. Like how widespread they already are, and yeah, it's kind of scary, I guess. That's going into the future. It's gonna be something else to worry about.
Yeah.
So just let's see, looking down here at the chat. Actually, there are currently no questions in the Q&A. So if anyone in the audience has any questions, just feel free to put them in the chat. And all right, so we'll wait a few minutes, but while we're waiting, I actually have a question for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you mentioned briefly that like there are no chemical for like pesticides that target these. Is there any, do you know if there's anything that works that you can use?
So unfortunately, there's not. I know that there's a lot of folks that are looking at chemical irritants, so things like saponins or like activated charcoal, something that would be irritating to their bodies. Limited results on that. I believe this research is being done out of the University of Wisconsin because they've had jumping worms for a little bit longer than us. So we're sort of leaning on them to take the lead on the research to try to help us figure out what we can do here. Unfortunately, they're not finding anything that is effective enough. And when we're talking about any kind of pesticide use, there's always a risk. There's always an inherent risk. So when we're using any kind of chemicals in the environment, the reward has to be greater than the risk. And right now, any of the products that they are trying, the risk is far outweighing the reward. So there's nothing that's been shown to be effective as it is right now. Again, hopeful that will change as research goes on, but there's nothing, there's no soil additives, there's nothing that we can pour over it to help out. There's just not a whole lot, unfortunately.
Okay. We do have a
And
question here. Oh, do you want to read
sorry,
it?
I have a question as well. Someone was telling me that they were buying compost that was certified jumping worm free. So that doesn't sound like it's even a possibility, but I guess that's a term out there that people are buying into.
So yeah, it is possible in that soil might have been heat treated. So they basically would take all of that soil and they would bake it for basically, over the 104 degrees Fahrenheit. So the same thing that you can try to achieve through using the sun and solarizing, they just have a way more efficient method of doing that. So that's just a form of heat. I would imagine that's just what they're trying to say is that they heat treated that compost or that soil or that mulch so that there's less likelihood of there being any cocoons or worms active in it. So I would trust that if on the off chance there's a cocoon that survived that kind of heat treatment, because they're going much higher than 104 degrees off. They are really baking it to kill not only jumping worms but other pests that might be in something like compost. So I do think that if you are going to buy compost, I would really try to find compost that is advertised to be heat treated or jumping worm free. That's really going to be your best bet. Besides visually inspecting that compost, looking for worms, just doing what you can with what you've learned. But I would say that there's definitely some truth to that. Yeah, I would say that that's a fairly safe bet. Yeah.
And how about when you're buying bagged compost from a garden center?
So I have the same concerns. If the bag explicitly says that it has been heat treated, I would say it's okay. If the bag does not say it has been heat treated, or if it's like the nursery's compost that they have bagged and it's not really well labeled or something like that, or it's just a pile you can take from, I would have a conversation with that nursery. And if they do not heat treat their compost or their mulch or anything like that, personally, I would not be buying. I would not purchase. If they say that they do that and they can show you or they can tell you more about that and they seem very educated about jumping worms or other pests that can be picked up in things like that, that would be more likely for me to purchase something like that. Yeah,
sure.
But you can always open that conversation with nurseries. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
So it does look like we have a question in the chat. And the question is, what is the ultimate goal with invasive species management? Eradication or simply controlled management? And I feel like that probably depends on the species, but
it does. So invasive species are so tricky because there's nothing to keep them in check. Whenever we have an outbreak of a native species, like right now, for instance, we have forest tent caterpillars that are wreaking havoc all over Aroostook County. They're also called tent or army caterpillars. You know, you're seeing them all over the sides of buildings, and they're creating havoc all over the roads. Our native pests can still be pests. They can still cause problems. We usually leave them alone. When it comes to invasive species like jumping worms or browntail moth, say, there's really no controlling them because there's nothing else to keep them in check. They didn't evolve with our plants or any of our animals here, so there's nothing that really goes after them because they're not familiar with what they are. They don't know that it's a food source. You might see some predation, but they're really not going to go for it because it's not what they evolved with. They're not going to know. And when it comes to things that work for their native habitat, it doesn't necessarily translate to our habitat because it's different. We have different plants and we have different trees here. So ultimately, the goal of invasive species, if we could eradicate them, that would be great. But at this point, especially in terms of jumping worms, it's just not going to happen. They're here. They don't see them going anywhere. There's not going to be some explosive like biocontrol agent that's going to wipe them all out as much as we all wish that there was. They're here to stay. It's really at this point just management and control to the best of our ability. And we'll have better management and control as research on goes. And again, when we find a solution that's actually effective and that reward outweighs the risk, that's really what we're waiting for. But right now, it's solarizing, it's handpicking, it's education, it's prevention, and just doing what we can to manage it. Because at this point, they're here, they're not going to go anywhere. So it's figuring out a balance for them and for us.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's any more questions. So with that, yeah, I just want to say thank you again for joining us and for posting these resources that folks can check out. And if you send these resources to me, I can put them on our website too afterwards.
Oh yeah, I can definitely do that. And if folks do have questions, like I said, feel free to just send me an email. I'm happy to help. And just thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Brittany.
All right. Bye. Thank you.
Take care.